Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Movie Crusaders. My name's Sean Wasserkrug, and today we're going to be reviewing one of my most anticipated films for 2021 and 2020, Edgar Wright's The Last Night in Soho. Uh, like most people, I'm a very huge fan of Edgar Wright. I love the Cornetto trilogy, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz. Not the biggest fan of At World's End, but as a whole, I like the Cornetto trilogy. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is hands down probably one of my favorite films ever. Of course, Baby Driver, pretty solid film as well. So when I saw that he was going to be doing this particular film, which all I could really tell from it was that it was a kind of a time, not a time loop, but kind of like going back between present day to the 60s horror type of film. I was immediately invested, and then I saw who the cast was, and I saw that Thomasin McKenzie, who I have been just in love with as an actress ever since Jojo Rabbit, and then Anya Taylor-Joy, who she's a particular taste, but I really enjoy her and pretty much everything that she's done. And then of course you add Matt Smith, who is hands down my favorite Doctor Who, or the Doctor. I was so overwhelmingly excited to see this film, so much so that outside of the initial teaser of this film, I steered clear of anything showing any kind of footage or anything that literally could cause me to know anything that was happening in this film. I just wanted to go in as bare bones as I possibly could outside of the initial teaser trailer. And I was so excited. I was counting down the days to watch this movie. So I finally got to see it. So going into this film, I would say going in as bare bones as you can, like I did, definitely is going to help you. Because if you start to watch the trailers and stuff like that, you're really going to start kind of see the writing on the wall and knowing exactly what's going to happen and everything going there. So if you can avoid trailers and kind of reading the synopsis or anything like that, please do that before you hop into this film. One of the great things about Edgar Wright as a director is, first off, phenomenal music choices. He always knows the right music to kind of play. And then he also is fantastic at making movies look amazing. Just a beautiful visual eye. Whether it's something as basic as a zombie comedy like Shaun of the Dead, or something like a Baby Driver or a Scott Pilgrim, he knows how to make these movies look majestic in certain respects, especially when we get to the 1960s part of this film. He just has that eye. Now, you can credit that to the cinematographers and stuff like that, but Edgar Wright has to have some kind of leeway into that, and Edgar Wright definitely knows what he's doing when he films his movies. In terms of the plot, you're basically following Thomasin McKenzie's Eloise, or Ellie. She's from a small town, and she's always wanted to be a fashion designer, and she had gotten accepted into the Arts of London University. So she's going out there on her own. She's got a very particular thing about her. She's kind of got a sixth sense, which anyone who knows the sixth sense is basically she can see dead people. But as she goes there, she's kind of a fish out of water. You got the mean girls, you got all this kind of stuff in the dorm rooms. So she decides that she needs to live on her own, not live there. And she basically finds this, kind of like apartment. And from there, she, as she goes to bed at night, she falls into a dream state that takes her back to the 1960s. And that's where we see Anya Taylor-Joy's Sandy. And that's kind of where the story goes. And as Ellie further and further becomes obsessed with this Sandy character that she has kind of been following in her dreams, you start to find out that the story is not quite as glamorous as Ellie once thought it was the first couple nights she was with her. And that's really where the meat of Last Night in Soho really comes into play. For people who think this is straight up horror, I don't necessarily agree with that. It does have horror elements, but to me this is more of a psychological thriller slash mystery. And I think Edgar Wright does a solid job with that. In terms of the cast, Thomasin McKenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy are phenomenal in their performances. Thomasin McKenzie is always amazing in everything that I've seen her in. Now, I know she's in other things besides Jojo Rabbit, but she does a great job of playing this kind of the soft yet strong character, and I think she does a great job with Ellie throughout the film as she progressively starts to go down this rabbit hole of everything that's happening to Sandy and to her, and this kind of obsession slash sickness of what's happening to her throughout the film. I think Mackenzie knocks it out of the park. Anya Taylor-Joy's Sandy, first off, her rendition of Downtown is beautiful. She sings that beautifully. It's a highlight of the film, hence why it's on all the trailers. But her descent into where her character goes based into the film, I think Anya Taylor-Joy does a great job of that. There's a reason why she's such a popular, thought after, actress in Hollywood right now. And these two women are going to be a force. If they aren't already, they are growing into a bigger force. These girls are going to be everywhere. So get used to seeing both of them around. Matt Smith's Jack. Honestly, the first time you meet him is probably the bulk of what you could see of his character, and then he's just kind of there throughout the rest of the film. So I kind of wish we'd gotten a little bit more of Matt Smith in terms of his character. I mean, we do get stuff. I don't want to say too much in terms of spoiler, but I do wish we could have gotten a little bit more of Matt Smith in this film. I feel like he's such a fantastic actor, but he just hasn't had a film that really has just let him do stuff. And he's going to be in the Game of Thrones spinoff, so maybe that's where he's really going to get to do it. But I mean, I was watching him as the Doctor in Doctor Who for 3 to 5 years. He deserves to have a film where he can really just kind of go out there and do his own thing. And sadly, this is not that film for him. Visually, like I said before, Edgar Wright is fantastic at making things look visually majestic and magical. And when Ellie goes into this dream state that takes her back to the 1960s, it is fantastic. It looks gorgeous. The lighting, the camera angles of how they kind of show how Sandy's walking down the stairs, but in the reflection you see Ellie following her, or vice versa. It's great magical movie magic in terms of showing and visualizing that these are two people that are basically one in this little world, and then also how it adapts into later elements of the film. Edgar Wright does a great job of giving you that visual eye candy that make you basically just fall into the story of Ellie and Sandy. In terms of once we get into the meat of the film, that is kind of where I think Last Night in Soho kind of not necessarily falls apart, but really just kind of doesn't feel Edgar Wright-y enough. And that's one of the great things about Edgar Wright is he's got quippy dialogue, and it's kind of stylized and just feels cool and mellow. And this is probably Brian, my co-host on Weekend Crusaders. He couldn't do the review to me tonight, but he said this is the least Edgar Wright film that he's ever seen, and I agree with that. This doesn't really feel like an Edgar Wright written film. Now visually, it looks like Edgar Wright, but it didn't feel like an Edgar Wright film to me. And for some people that could be a plus or that could be a minus. For me, that's a minus, because one of the things I loved most about Edgar Wright movies, whether it be Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Pilgrim, Baby Driver, all of them, is that they've got a great, well-rounded cast. So outside of Simon Pegg's Shaun, or Michael Cera's Scott, or El Gore's Baby, the cast around him feel well thought out. They are their own individual characters. They get great screen time, and it doesn't have to be carried by the lead actor, because he's got a phenomenal supporting cast around them. In Last Night in Soho, outside of Mackenzie and Anya, the rest of the cast is just really not there for me. I mean, Michael Ajao, he plays John. He's fine, but it's not, he just feels like a normal run-of-the-mill kind of character you would see in that particular role. Terrence Stamp's got, good elements here or there, but it struck home enough because they're trying to lead you down one storyline path with him. It just kind of is all there in terms of just being a giant tease. Like I said, Matt Smith's not utilized enough, and that's really, and then even the Mean Girls. Besides just bickering and side chat in the room where Ellie is, there's not really enough there. It really rides on Thomasin McKenzie and Anya Taylor-Joy to really carry this entire film. And that's the one thing that's different from an Edgar Wright film, is that normally he doesn't do that. You have people like Mary Elizabeth Winstead, John Hamm, Jamie Foxx, Kevin Spacey, or Nick Frost, or any of these guys to help add more fuel to that lead character. And Soho just doesn't have that. It just, that was one thing that was really missing, and I think that's where, like, in the second act and in the third act, that it just kind of felt lost and a little bit repetitive in what it was doing, because you don't have that strong supporting cast around the two leads to really make the story a little more lively, and especially after the first act. Anya Taylor-Joy's character, Sandy, kind of takes a backseat, and it's literally all on Thomasin McKenzie's Ellie, which, while she does a fine job, she doesn't have enough support from the rest of the cast to really elevate the character past a certain point, except for, you know, her going further and further down this dark rabbit hole of the Sandy storyline. But even then, Anya Taylor-Joy's Sandy is just kind of little glimpses here and there, and is not really delved in as much as it is in the first act. The first act is this beautiful, magical, fun, story about a girl who's kind of transported back to the 60s following this character. And in the second act, it takes a darker turn, and you start to get kind of the supernatural horror elements. And then the third act, there's a twist that you see a mile away that really just is kind of eh. And that's always the biggest problem to me with Edgar Wright. And while I love him as a director, his third acts to me tend to always kind of be too over the top. And while this one's not necessarily that, he makes certain choices in his third acts, whether it be something like a Hot Fuzz, Baby Driver, or other films where I feel like he doesn't quite know how to end his movies, that he feels like he has to go over the top with it, or he has to do something big and bombastic to end it on a big front, and he doesn't have to do that. And this movie doesn't necessarily do that in a sense, but by the time we get to the twist and you add the supernatural elements, visually, looks great. Looks great visually. But it just doesn't hit home the way you would want, or the way you normally get out of an Edgar Wright film. So in terms of the film as itself, it just kind of feels, like Brian said, not an Edgar Wright film in a sense. And it's kind of a disappointment in terms of that. Like, visually, it looks amazing. It's acted incredibly well by the two female leads, but it just feels a little empty. The story itself does not feel strong enough, or the story could be strong enough, but in the second act, it just feels like a rinse and repeat of the same thing I've seen 3 or 4 times already in the movie, until we get to this inevitable twist that just doesn't hit home the way it's supposed to be. And then you get the big kind of bombastic end. It's very, in terms of other films of his, it's very toned down, but in terms of just what the film was to that point, it does get very over the top. But it ultimately, Last Night in Soho, it feels like a disappointment to me as a film. It's still a really, really good film, mind you. I'm not saying it's a bad movie and you shouldn't check it out. But in terms of my anticipation for it and what I was hoping for and what I was expecting out of it, it just did not hit where I was wanting it to be. And that could just be a personal thing for me. Baby Driver, first time watching Baby Driver did not hit where I wanted it to be. But then when I watched it, 6 months to a year later, I appreciated and enjoyed it a hell of a lot more than I did the first time watching it. And maybe Last Night in Soho is going to be that for me, but right now, it just didn't, it did a lot of good, and then there's just a lot that just, he could have done better, or he could have hit a little harder to make this film feel like an Edgar Wright film, or could have, maybe hit the horror elements a little bit harder, or it felt like he didn't want to go full-blown into one section. He just kept wanting to kind of take pieces of a movie and then just kind of push it all together, which is very un-Edgar Wright-y of himself. But overall, it just was fine, but did not quite hit the expectations that I was expecting out of an Edgar Wright psychological thriller / horror. In terms of recommendations, obviously if you're an Edgar Wright fan, you're going to check this out. If you're a fan of Thomasin McKenzie or Anya Taylor-Joy, obviously you should check this out. If you're looking for a big Matt Smith film for your Doctor Who fans out there, this is not going to be it, but it definitely is nice to see him in a different kind of role than the Doctor. Like I said, visually, it looks gorgeous. Should you check this out? I think it's still worth a decent look. I'm not saying it's going to be one of the best films of the year, because it's not. But it's definitely worth a check out for your Edgar Wright fans and the next set of fans of the two actresses. Going to my overall score, I'm going to give Last Night in Soho a 79%. Like I said, visually, it's amazing. The two leads are fantastic in the film. It's just, once you hit the second and third act, they just don't hit quite as well as the initial first act. There's many, many more things I could probably touch on and go into, but I'm trying to not spoiler it nearly as much. There's other things I can go into and delve into, but I'm just not going to do that. So if you want to know more, contact me. I'll let you know. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you guys did, go and hit that like, share, and subscribe button to the channel so you guys stay up to date with all the latest videos that pop up on the Movie Crusaders. Of course, don't forget to follow us on all the social media outlets you see below. Coming up next, I don't know if I'm going to be able to see Antlers or not this weekend. If I do, there will be a review for that. Also, Army of Thieves comes out here in about 4 hours or so on Netflix, so I'll try to check that out. If I do, there will be a review for that. And then, of course, next week we've got Eternals. I think Love Hard. There's a bunch of things. Spencer. There's one other one I'm blanking out. I think the Harder They Fall. But then again, Brian, Michaels, and myself will be back again for another episode of the Weekend Crusaders. Our episode for this week should be dropping here very, very shortly, so be on the lookout for that. Here's a sneak peek of the movies that we are going to be talking about. And then, of course, we'll be back next week to talk about 5 more movies that come out during that week in movie history. But yeah, till next time, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, and good night, Movie Crusaders.
You're still here. It's over. Go home.